Hello and welcome to the Atlanta History Center's first virtual author talk, actually for our author talk series. I'm Virginia Prescott, host of GPB's On Second Thought and your host for these talks. Tonight I'm talking with Mab Segrest about her new book, Administrations of Lunacy, Racism and the Haunting of American Psychiatry at the Milledgeville Asylum. You can purchase the book directly from Acapella Books at the link it's provided at the Atlanta History Center's website. There's also a link to the right of your screen on the chat. And that is also where you can ask questions. Please do submit your questions while I'm talking with Mab. I'll try to integrate them as much as possible. You can use the Q&A tab that's at the bottom of your screen. Mab Segrest is a professor emeritus of gender and women's studies at Connecticut College and a longtime activist in social justice movements. She's author of Memoir of a Race Traitor, Fighting Racism in the American South. A 25th anniversary edition of that book came out in 2019. She's also author of My Mama's Dead Squirrel and other books. And Mab Segrest, welcome. So nice to speak with you.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here. Really delighted.
So you spent more than a decade writing this book. What is it that first grabbed you and held you for so long?
Well, Carson McCullers got me committed to Milledgeville. I grew up in Alabama, Tuskegee, right on the cusp of Georgia, and I really loved Southern literature growing up in the South in the 1950s and a kind of apartheid culture, a little white girl in a segregated family and pretty conservative family. I was always looking for how to understand this, and I turned a lot to writers. Tried to read Sound and the Fury, which was 11th grade, and a little confused by that, but I really loved Carson McCullers. I'm very queer, gender bending, and I really loved Frankie Adams. And Frankie was threatened, like, you better be careful, they're going to drag you off to Milledgeville. Frankie didn't know what Milledgeville was, but she knew she didn't want to go there. And I knew that I had been threatened to be dragged off to Bryce's, which was the Alabama hospital, in the 1950s and 60s when I was at my most interesting and curious. You better be careful, and you didn't know, but you knew you shouldn't do it. And then I found out from my Aunt May, the deep, dark secret in the Segrest family, which was my great-grandfather, Charles Bosch Segrest, Confederate veteran, died in Bryce's Hospital in Alabama in 1901. And he was committed by his family because he thought he saw people shooting at him from trees, and then he started shooting back, and they felt like that was too dangerous, and they sent him off. Mm-hmm. And then he died 6 months later from an infection, a cellulitis infection on his face, which a lot of people did, I found, in these asylums. And my aunt thought he was either had PTSD from the Civil War. He was in the Army of Northern Virginia, brutal, very brutal fighting at the end of the war, rivers red with blood, or pellagra, which was starting to be rampant in the South in the 1900s. So I was very curious, and she said that his commitment explained all the peculiarities in the Segrest family, and I had been trying to understand these peculiarities for a long time. So all of those things really drew me, but mainly I wanted to write on Carson. I Googled Milledgeville and Asylum, and I found this amazing article from the Atlanta Constitution, I think, in 1998, where the Consumer Council, which is the survivors of State Mental Hospital in Georgia, had come back to visit, gone to the train station museum, seen the lobotomy tools, seen the straitjackets, seen the shot boxes, were weeping, then went to the memorial, what was the cemetery, one of 7. There's 25,000 bodies out there, marked only with metal stobs, and they went out to see some of them. They were just sobbing then. Mm-hmm. And there's one quotation, like it was the most gruesome sight in Georgia. Shunned when living, abandoned in death. They could have been us. Only God knew them. It was devastating, and the voice just grabbed me. And so 2 weeks later, I was in the train station. I was in the cemetery. I really was drawn because it's like, wow, this is a hell of a story. You have the scenes, you have the drama, you have the conflict, and you have these deeply engaged voices and people. And I just felt like it just drew me, and I thought I was going to write about Carson. And then the more I studied it, the more I saw there really wasn't the history I thought there would be. And there's not histories of Southern asylums, which had profound effects on people. So I thought, well, wow, let me see if I can do that. And 15 years later, finally, surprisingly to me, finished the book.
And you go deep into the history of the
Well,
what originally opened as the Georgia State Lunatic, Idiot, and Epileptic Asylum, founded in 1842. But you go back to the founding of the Georgia colonies in the 1730s, and even further to the Muskogee and Cherokee Indians who were later forced off the land. What bearing did they have, that history, on the Georgia Asylum built in 1842?
well, I've always been a history, like when I was those questions I was asking myself as a white girl in kind of apartheid Alabama. Studying history has given me the answers to them. And this question of like the intimate and the historic and how things happen and why, it was always a recourse to history for me. And I first got interested in the Georgia Asylum from the 1940s in McCullers, and then I kept getting drawn back because I wanted to see, like, well, what did it mean to have an asylum founded in 1842 in a slave culture? And then
Mhm.
by the time I got back to there, it's like, but 5 years ago was the last of the Trail of Tears, where the Cherokees were forced out. And so how do I understand that? How do I explain that when it's not in any of the records? And then what about slavery? Because what I found was these asylum histories of particular institutions and also of the history of US asylums have really been scrubbed of the most painful, fascinating, tumultuous, real aspects of US history. So I really wanted to write an asylum history that put the asylum back into that history and put the people who were drawn to the asylum or committed to the asylum, sometimes for 40 years, back into that history to understand how the manifestations that got them there, how they were interpreted, grew out of this settler colonial culture, this culture of conquest and moving out indigenous people and bringing in African people and growing cotton and everything.
Yeah.
So that became the whole project.
Well, they did change how communities cared for people considered quote unquote lunatics or idiots or imbeciles. And you uncovered a number of the stories that those that had been scrubbed over
Yeah,
from a number of patients, like Frances Edwards.
right.
She was admitted 1856. So, what was her story, and how does that illustrate some of those familial and communal dynamics of the time?
Um, I really was determined to tell the story of the asylum from the perspective of its patients, because there's so little actual patient stories and patient narratives in psychiatry. So I looked and, so I found from all different ways the way to get these stories. And Frances's story was in the ledgers of the Georgia Asylum, which I spent my first semester in Georgia going through the microfiche at the Georgia archives, and you just go and you go and it's so bleh, it's, and then all of a sudden something jumps out at you, and it's written, the person who wrote it realizes this is a good story and it's almost like a little short story or something. And Frances was like that, and she was in there, I mean, and the way that the story was told too was perplexing. It's like her husband had put her in there. She had turned against him for some peculiar reason. She started being weirdly, like maybe she was a witch. She had all this theology that people didn't like. People started looking at her weird and encouraged her husband to do that. And then at a certain point, she got furious at him. And then at some point, he beat her with a wagon whip. And then she had a baby and she came to the asylum. And I thought, okay, now, where does he beat her with a wagon whip go in this story? And I think it goes right before, and all of a sudden she was alienated in her affections for him. So what happened to women, white women in these families in the South, where the slave culture was permeating them, whether or not they owned slaves or on a plantation in town or something, there were a lot of whips lying around in Georgia and a lot of
Mhm.
how to use them. And I read Lauren Swiniger's book on divorces, and there were lots of the main reason for divorces of white women in antebellum Georgia and in the South was brutality by the husbands. And there were other women who were beat with the wagon whips. So Frances became that kind of a way to unpack what that domestic violence was in white families and how it was showing up in the asylum, and how really the violence of patriarchy, the violence of white supremacy, the violence of the settler culture had affected the psyches and the behaviors that got people there or got them sent there. Also, one of the other things I had found in that first year of the microfiche, which can put your eyes out, it really can,
Mhm.
was all of a sudden, after 1842, by the 1850s, you knew why people were coming. There was homicide, there were suicides, there were attack. He killed his father, he attacked his father, tried to jump down a well, tried to drown herself. There was lots of violence all of a sudden showing up in the records. I think it had been there all along, but the person writing it down started, I think, being more interested in that. And also people were getting used to sending folks off to the asylum there. So Frances was one of those illustrations of the level of violence embedded, familial violence, cultural violence, interpersonal violence embedded in a slave culture. And she really illustrated what happened to those women. And many women went to the asylum because they were being abused by their husbands in all different ways. The husbands never went, but the women went. So Frances let me get into all of those gender dynamics.
There's a question here from the audience that speaks to that. What was the makeup of patients by gender? And then the question is, any top reasons you discovered, maybe reasons why they were there, if you want to clarify the person who asked the question.
I didn't track gender all the way through it statistically, but there were a little bit more men than women there. I think one of the myths or preconceptions is all the women got thrown in because they had these radical pre-feminist ideas and so forth, but there's a whole range of things. But people went there because I think I got the sense of there's a tripwire back in the community at home, and something will happen. You will hit that wire, and the people who used to tolerate you or take care of you, they won't do it anymore. They can't do it anymore. And now we have a place to send you. We can send you to Milledgeville. So we'll do that. So if your husband died, for instance, or you were in menopause and your husband was kind of stressed about that, or you had a fever, or you might have had a baby and were depressed, whatever. But there had, families and communities had to take care of folks. And then all of a sudden in 1842, wow, you didn't necessarily have to do it. You started looking at people a little bit more. So it was a variety of things. And really what constituted insanity was a kind of compendium of all those things. The people who landed there because they're getting committed from their counties. This is really a story of all the counties in Georgia and all the families in Georgia, really. And what happens to tumble you into the asylum then is determined by back home and what event is precipitating this that gets you sent away.
And this dynamic changes tremendously after the Civil War, when in 1867, basically the Georgia asylum is forced, basically by the military that is occupying, or the Union soldiers that are now occupying Georgia, to admit patients of color. And I want to get to your subtitle, of course, Racism and the Haunting of American Psychiatry at the Milledgeville Asylum. How is racism connected to this foundation of American psychiatry outside of Milledgeville and the South, especially at that time?
Well, the more I studied, the more I came to see that, like, the state asylum is where there's a mediation between the psyche of the individual and the culture and the needs of the state and these settlers colonial states. Like a settler colonial state is where the Europeans come and settle and stay. They don't just rule from afar and send the goods back home to the mother country, France, England, Spain, or whatever, So we were a settler colonial culture, and the settlers took over in 1776 so that they got the goods of the continent, right? So what does the state need in this process? And what the function of the asylum was, in addition to consolidating the state, like it used to be everybody was in the county, and now you sent people to the capital of Georgia, which was Milledgeville, from 1804 to 1866, 67. But what psychiatry was doing across the board in these asylums, which were the first places where there was psychiatry, the asylum doctors were the first psychiatrists. And what I saw that they were doing is like stripping the history from the symptoms of the people who came in there. So you would have this description of, like, Frances Edwards, and maybe she's smoking, and she's mad at her husband, and who knows where that came from, and she's got a weird religion, but it doesn't say, just a minute now. there's something else going on. He's beat her, like that. The history was really stripped of Frances, and you had to go back and rearrange the narrative to know her husband had the freedom to beat her, he beat her, and then he had the power to send her off. So those stories about power and control and history, basically history, they're not in the mix. And so once you've taken the history out from people, you can just call them anything. And you also don't have to be accountable for the amount of pain there is in a culture of conquest, a culture of slavery, a culture of Indian removal. I mean, there's huge amounts of trauma in all of that. But if you have these asylums that don't deal with that, then you can rewrite the history too. And the people who are being the most victimized, like, they can be the most blamed. And I really started to see how psychiatry in these asylums was this place of both practice, of teaching people to stay in line. You better be careful. We'll send you to Milledgeville or Bryce's or Jackson or wherever. But also an ideological production about who people were, what degenerate populations were, and who deserved sanity or equality or whatever. And the asylums really delivered that. They did it all across the country. But before 1900, 90% of African Americans lived in the South. So the Southern asylums played a particular role in formulating anti-Black racism pre and post Reconstruction, especially after emancipation. Mm-hmm. And then the Northern asylum superintendents, who didn't have experience with Black people and had moved all the Native people out, then relied on Southern superintendents when they saw as the experts on the Negro. So it was this real cauldron, really, of both practices against people and of ideologies of race and white supremacy.
And what became sort of codified at that time was the idea that because after the war, as expected by the Surgeon General, there were floods of people going to the asylum in Georgia and in other places. The trauma of war is one of the things you point out, obviously, but also the trauma of Reconstruction and slavery and torture and lynching, and the white superintendent at Milledgeville and other places believe that it was emancipation itself that had actually made Black people crazy, for lack of a better word. They were unmoored from the safety of the plantation. This was supported by the superintendent, T.O. Powell. So how did this actually support the lost cause narrative and the repression of Black people during Reconstruction?
I want to go back to the Civil War just briefly, and then I want to get to this Reconstruction piece, but it's really a pivot point in the narrative that I'm telling. But war is brutal, and the prevailing explanation of insanity was it was hereditary. And even if you broke down in the middle of a war like the Civil War, which had the highest level of violence of any, like it matched almost anything in the 20th century per capita, just brutal wars. These soldiers marched, they fought, they collapsed, they got up, they had to bury their buddies around them, they had to march again. I mean, it was just, you broke down the body, you broke down the mind, and there was a huge amount of psychic breaks there. But people were blamed for that, or they were sent back to the front lines, and there was no real explanation of what we would call PTSD or shell shock, So those veterans there, nobody really understood them, and they were blamed, like, well, you're not manly enough there, So the white people who were soldiers there weren't getting very good, weren't being, their trauma was not understood either, and it wasn't understood after the war, but particularly acute for Black people. That whole narrative about slavery is hygienic and it's good for you, and white people are taking care of you, and so those Yankees better not free you, and you better not free yourself, because God knows what will happen. So when emancipation comes, there's brutal repression. The Klan starts in 86 and 87, and I really trace this in a lot of detail. And also, Black people come into the asylum in 1867, right when all of this other stuff is starting to happen. And they come in very often with no history provided. So-and-so, so-and-so, Lewis, so-and-so, no history provided. So I really want to show in the book what that history is. Like, this is an example of asylum psychiatry scrubbing patients of history. And if there's any kind of limit text to this, is having African Americans come in 1867 after slavery, after the war, after emancipation, after now Klan violence is starting all across these counties, and they have no history, then what not gonna, I'm not cursing in my Zooms these days, but what in the world does that mean, not to have lynching be history? So I made a list from the ledgers of all the Black people who came in the first 10 or 15 years, first from the Freedmen's Bureau and then from the counties, and I made it by county. And then I had a very smart student assistant when I was at Georgia College, Ashley Cahill, and I wanted to match up these Black people with the lynchings, and I didn't have the list of lynchings from 1867 to 1880 because all the lynching lists and research starts in 1880. So Stephanie McClure, a wonderful colleague at Georgia College when I was there for a semester, knew Woody Beck, who's one of the scholars on lynching, and he just happened to have that 1867 to 1880 list of lynchings from Georgia by county and chronology. So I got Ashley to match up the Black people who came in as patients and the lynchings, and it turned out that Sally Cunningham, who came in with no history furnished, was from the county, Columbia County, near Augusta, had the most lynchings in this period, 8 or 9. So I just go down all those lynchings, and then what does it mean to Sally Cunningham, who's got to know this? This is like Appling. And I drove through Appling when I was going to Jazz Fest when we could travel, It's a little bitty wide place in the road, and people had to know each other there. And the jails there, courthouses there. Sally would have known, 8 people, 9 people, and all the different ways that Black people were being lynched there. So she comes in with a huge amount of trauma, as any Black person was happening all across Georgia as these campaigns of terror were going on. And she comes in with no history furnished. So as I say in the book, and this is the place where I get the most mad, I let myself really step out from behind and say, just a minute now, if psychiatry cannot register lynching, then what can it register? And what is going on when lynching, which is brutal, I mean, I not go into it in a lot of detail, but people were dismembered, they were burned. I mean, terrible, terrible combination, just sadistic, like the most combination of sadism. And this at the county level is neither a pathology. None of these people are sent for being lynchers. That's not in the ledgers. And it's not a crime. This brutality is not a crime. The sheriff doesn't arrest you. He's arresting Black men, send them off to Convict, lease, but doesn't arrest that. So if it's neither a pathology or a crime, then there's this big gap, the interpsychic crypt, one theorist talked about, that these things just fall into. And then once all of this violence has fallen into the crypt and you have no history, then you can start to be blamed for everything because you should have stayed a slave. We told you should have stayed a slave. And you can see in some of these police videos these days, actually, just what that looks like. I mean, when you kill a man by keeping your knee on his neck for 8 minutes when people around you are begging not to, and you just cold brutality, that's like you should have stayed a slave. I really think that kind of continuing brutal anti-Black racism is in there too. And so I felt like right at that point, I kind of had my finger in the archives on this process of denuding people from history, and then you start to blame them. And so by the turn of the century, you have the problem Negro, because anything that happened, from sharecropping to poverty to repression of the vote, just must have been heartbreaking after freedom, like, oh my God, like the Jubilee and freedom. And this beautiful passage from Du Bois that I quote, like free at last, and yet they weren't, and because the South really lost the war and it won peace. And by 1876, white supremacy was restored. And then this you had to eliminate the Black vote, which happened with violence, and you had to eliminate Black equality in this idea they should have stayed slaves. It's all blamed on their nature, was being propagated and developed within psychiatry. So it was very much part of this lost cause ideology that was 1867. This guy Edwin Pollard wrote the book, but really it was the post-Confederate playbook, and it's playing today. So this carries over in the 20th century, but you should have had the problem white person, the lyncher, but instead you had the problem Black person. And
of course, the EJI and others have pointed out that what that racial terror did to not just Black communities by holding them in suspending them in fear, but the brutality and how that affected white people.
Right.
as well. A couple questions here. I wonder if we can kind of tie them into each other. One, for those who were committed by others or perhaps self, were they released, and what constituted grounds for the release? And then another, this may lead to who actually gets swept up, because during the U.S. Reconstruction there were loitering laws against African Americans. Did your research show former slaves sent to a
I think I get the gist of your question. A little frozen here, but I could start to answer it maybe. Is that good?
I'm sorry, I lost you for a half second. So,
Yeah, I lost you too. But the loitering laws and what happens to Black people, and do they get swept up into there? And I was expecting that, like any kind of carceral space, you could put a Black person in, they would put them in there. But actually, that was not true, because the spots at the asylum, because of overcrowding, were really prime for the counties, because a lot of white people they wanted to send off, and they didn't want too many Black people taking that up, because if they had to extend the space, it was more expensive, and God knows most Georgia politicians weren't going to spend anything on human needs. So so up until about 1888, Black people were capped at 13%, and then it hit 30% in 1888. But in the meantime, you had convict lease, and so you had Black men and Black women too, but mainly Black men being rounded up into the prison system that became then immediately leased out to major corporations to build the New South. So you had from kind of zero Black people in the penitentiary, which was burned down and then wasn't opened up again, because that was white people, and we're going to do something different now. It's going to be the labor system. And then those people were rented out to corporations, and there were maybe 2,400 Black men. I don't remember exactly by the end of the century. And so 90% of Black people went into convict lease, where 30% went into the asylum. The other 70% was kept for white people. So especially with convict lease, they were just sweeping people up. They changed misdemeanors to felonies so they could get people and send them off, and made a huge amount of money off of that too.
mhm. Well, that is one of the things that you point out, the Georgia asylum evolves into the Georgia sanatorium, and when it was closed later, the Central State Hospital. There's also an evolution of treatment, right? There's heroic therapy initially, very aggressive purging involving a lot of let's say diarrhea, defecation, moving stuff through, bleeding people, moral therapy, and then occupational therapy, putting inmates to work in production of produce and meat and milk, tremendous amounts of output in production to defray the costs of care. So tell us a little bit about how these treatments worked. There's a question here: any evidence of experimentation on patients, and what were the treatment practices back in the 1800s, and what was documented as effective?
Right. It wasn't scientific enough to be experimentation, because this heroic medicine, which was bodily humors, 4 different humors, and you had to balance them all out. It was kind of the hydraulic system of the fluids in the body, so you could bleed people to do that, and you could purge them in all different ways. And it would definitely, in an asylum, would calm people down. If you're throwing up, if you're going at both ends, if you've been given opiate, or if you've been bled, your energy level is going to drop there. So the moral therapy, though, was the idea of the Enlightenment, that you could transform the environments where the mad, the lunatic, had been brought just to confine them. And you can make these into curative spaces. So you can shift the environment, which is basically kind of sociology. You restructure something, people can behave better. And so they built these asylums that were on the outskirts of town. So Central State Hospital is 2 miles from the center of Milledgeville, which was near the capital. And they were supposed to be beautiful, and supposed to be, you had gardens and you could walk around, and you were getting away from your family, but it's supposed to be a very structured environment. And they didn't let people read the Bible, actually. They thought it upset people too much. You could read the newspaper, you could read books, you could go to church sometimes. But you had, and then the doctor could pay attention to you. But this was supposed to cap out at about 300 or 400 patients, and then you were treated well, you were treated kindly, and you got good food, and you got to walk some, and you did some work. But work wasn't going to be the whole thing, but the whole thing was supposed to be curative. But by the time you hit 1,000 patients or 2,300, moral therapy was gone, even though all the superintendents through the 19th century gestured to it as all the good that they were doing, but all those other things really fell away. And what really came to the fore was occupational therapy, and it was more occupation than therapy. And by 1888, when there's 30% Black people all of a sudden instead of 15, there are certain kind of markers of industrial production, and I really tracked it through pigs, because in 1874 there were 200 hogs that were slaughtered. By 1879, they listed it as 7,446 pounds of pork. So when you go from a pig to pork, you're really and you're talking about pounds. It's a more kind of industrial measure. By 1886, there were 10,400 something pounds of pork. By 1893, there were 29,728 pounds of pork. So there's a lot of pork being killed there and being produced there. I jumped forward at a certain point of the 1950s, and there was an abattoir or slaughterhouse on the asylum grounds, which is the only abattoir in Georgia. And they produced 649,610 pounds of pork. And the annual report bragged that the patients at that point did 2/3 of the labor. It's not so clear if the patients are actually working in the abattoir, but that they don't say anybody else is. So it's the most hellish kind of imagination of what you would do with a psychiatric patient is put them in one of these slaughterhouses. And I did a little bit of reading on it. And they're terrible places. I mean, they start the animals off at the top and they kill them, and then they go down a chute and there's somebody there and they're supposed to, and there's blood and there's sharp knives and it's all the pandemonium of these animals terrified, And this is psychiatric care, this is occupational therapy. No, it's occupations, and it's like work, and it's essential labor that, as we know today, is paid to lease and has a lease protection. So I can't say 100% it was patients who were doing this, but show me who else was doing it if it's not them. So this is the kind of mechanism that shifts this kind of jujitsu that's easy to happen in the South from the moral therapy to the plantation, to work. And it's very gendered. The white women do sewing, the Black women do laundry, the white men do the gardening, and the Black men do the agricultural production out in the colony farm, which includes growing cotton. So all of this starts to sound very familiar, and it becomes very much tracked to prisons too. Convict lease, and it's a very carceral system. It's not as bad as the state prison farm, which is dropped into Baldwin County also 1897 for women and young people and disabled men. And that's really brutal, but the whole thing is a very thick kind of stew. And one of the most poignant indicators of it was one of the things I saw when I went to Cherry Hospital here in North Carolina. I'm in Durham now. I'm finish this pretty soon because we got some more questions. But there was this cage in the museum. It's the only things left because a hurricane come through and flooded everything. But it explained how prison. This was a black psychiatric institution in North Carolina. How prisoners were put in this and then put out in the sun in August or September, or July or August, to calm them down, like a straitjacket, But it was very much like the portable car that they were using for convict lease to carry these Black people around. And so there was this really bleed over, I think, between the mechanisms, and it was on state land, south and north of Milledgeville, so it was easy to have all that stuff happening there. And today, Geo Prison has a little installation on what was the asylum ground, So anyway, that's kind of the next slide.
Well, that's one of the through lines that you point out in the book, the system, the asylum system, into now so many, 90%, it's estimated, of the people who are imprisoned are there. 9 out of 10 beds are in In,
No, yeah, no, the statistic is
yeah, really.
90% of state psychiatric beds are in jails and prisons.
Exactly. That's exactly right. We're going to run out of time soon, so I'm going to ask you to answer these really quickly. Did families of these patients pay for part or all of their stay, or was it paid through taxes in state of Georgia?
There were pay patients who, if they could, paid some, but mostly it was paid through the state of Georgia. In the early days, they just had made so much money off of selling native land that was stolen that they didn't hardly have to pay taxes, But after the Civil War, it was tax money.
And was there a criminal unit at Milledgeville, and who were its patients?
There were forensic units. Yeah, I mean, depends in some ways on what decade, but the Bostic building, I can see it right now, is where if you had somebody sent for, what's it called? Like, when you're insanity plea. Yeah, you murdered somebody or you killed them, but if you were insane, then you get sent to the asylum. And if you were not insane, then you get sent to the electric chair. So lots of people preferred the asylum to electric chair. And so they would have separate units then. Back in the 19th century, they just threw everybody in together, and you didn't always know who was what, but there were definitely separate institutions there. And the Cook building now was built most recently, and it's the most functional one. It's Forensic Hospital, which has all those combinations of folks, either people who have mental breaks in prison and then get sent there.
How many, interesting to know how the judicial system and the legislative bodies played a role in putting people into asylums, committing them, quote
It
unquote.
was by the county in the earliest days, and you had something like a grand jury so that the family or the sheriff or somebody could bring a person before that, and they had to have the family's permission, and people had to kind of hear the evidence, and then you would get, if they adjudged that, then you would go from the jail to the asylum. Although if you came in with no history, that habeas corpus was very often, I think, ignored. It changed in 1918, where it took three men, basically three white men. It's either a doctor and a judge, two doctors and a judge or something like that. But there's all these men from the county, and I can just kind of imagine them playing golf together, and so-and-so's wife is blah, 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 blah. I mean, it's very limited kind of access. So wasn't a very good way. I'm not sure. Today, it's a different kind of process.
You write in the book that the Georgia Sanitarium was a gaining the 20th century. Why Milledgeville, and what role did that play in the movement, which was consequential?
I kind of missed the first part of the question. We went on those things. So if you
Did you write in the book that the Georgia Sanitarium was a prime target for eugenics? Mm-hmm. So this movement that was gaining ground in the early 20th century. Can you tell us what role it played in that movement, and why Milledgeville in particular?
Well, Larson, who Eugenics History in Georgia, says that even in the 1910s, Georgia was the largest asylum in the United States. So they would naturally gravitate towards there. In 1910, the Carnegie Foundation establishes its second eugenics office in Cold Spring Harbor, and they start making all these lists and trying to go out to legislatures and basically get cognitively feeble-minded people institutionalized, and they have to do a bunch of things for that. But they want to get separate institutions, and they figure once they're separate institutions, they can do the sterilization. So Georgia is rife territory for that, but all of these institutions are, and the Stanford-Binet intelligence test is very much schemed up by the eugenics folks. So they've got Stanford University, they've got Columbia, like major universities behind this too. It has lots of steam behind it. It's got some of the richest people in the country trying to sterilize some of the poorest people in the country, and they're able to finally get the legal piece through in the Buck versus Bell Supreme Court case, which is Carrie Buck in West Virginia, whose mother was institutionalized and sterilized, and then she has a daughter. And the eugenics folks in this, it really makes me mad. I mean, it's almost hard to talk about it, but they set these women up. They set these females up. And they even give the 8-month-old an IQ test to be able to determine she's an imbecile, and Carrie's an imbecile, and her mother's an imbecile. And so Oliver Wendell Holmes, the jurist, writes the decision, and his last line is 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. And so he legitimizes sterilization in the light of the 14th Amendment, which says due process, equal protection. I mean, it's one of those amendments after the Civil War that's supposed to give you some rights, and it's completely gutted that way by Holmes. And so at that point, then the door to sterilization is opened. And there's a very poignant history of the Buck case that I really go into a lot, because I just thought, I mean, it was just terrible what happened to them. And then when you deny a family their reproductive history, you make them into, you know, you impoverish them because there's no children to take care of them or whatever. And it turned out to that none of those three Bucks, the girls, they were not, I mean, they were intelligent. They did well in school. They wrote letters, you know, like they were just set up. So that was kind of the sweep of eugenics, which gets to Georgia for the Eugenics Commission in 1937. And Georgia was slow to eugenics on that end because eugenics was seen as progressive, and Georgia wasn't progressive. So, and also Talmadge realized a lot of his constituency like fall into the surgery. But by 1937, they had a eugenics commission. And surreally, as much of this is, the head of the eugenics commission, the head of the asylum was this guy, Superintendent Peacock, in the 40s or 50s. And he was also the head of the eugenics commission. So he would write letters back and forth to himself on different stationery, asking for permission to sterilize a particular patient and then giving it. And then those people would be sterilized. So 3,000 to 5,000 women, mostly women, were sterilized in Georgia during that time and all across the country. And huge amounts of sterilization, more than happened with the Nazis, who also were sterilizing people too. 1939, the Nazi Actian T4 program was their first extermination program, was aimed at disabled people, because they had been making all those lists of all these people in hospitals and everything, and they took them into the gas chambers and they killed them.
And to think it began as T.O. Powell, then superintendent, said, would this not be a form of true benevolence to take corrective measures against people regarded as degenerates?
And Powell wasn't the only person saying that, but he was one of the main people. And he's the person, like, the Georgia Asylum was not the only place doing this. It's just we can see it when we look out from the Georgia Asylum, because things are written very large there because there's so many people there. So Powell wasn't the only person, but he was very early in this, and you can really trace him in that too, and you can see how it flips over.
Well, so now that, those are the voices of those women, and men who were sterilized, those that you found in the Georgia archives, their stories written on ledgers and patient intake forms, or whatever the equivalent was at the time. They are part of what haunts this book, and the haunting that you write about. But there's also the sort of physical form. This is 2,000 acres, closed. The asylum officially closed in 2010, so there are still some buildings operating. Some of the buildings were turned into prisons. And Denise asked, there's been much debate about what to do with the mostly vacated 1,750-acre Milledgeville campus. Any idea on repurposing or tributes to these patients when repurposing of the campus happens?
Well, yes. The state of Georgia has served Baldwin County very poorly, and it just walked away after deinstitutionalization and then the closing down, and left this psychiatric ruin. Many of those buildings have asbestos, so they were just boarded up. 10 buildings got turned to 5 maximum security prisons, and they have all of this terrible barbed wire all around them. And then they emptied out, so it's covered over by kudzu. Like, it's just it's a gothic, it's really a horror show out there. It really is. And so then it's Renaissance. I mean, it's hard to repurpose unless you really claim the history there. And there should never be another prison or prison-like operation on that campus, And one of the nursing homes now is taking prisoners who are too old and expensive for the prison system and putting them into this nursing home because it's cheaper for the state. And now it's one of the hot spots for COVID, So there's just this gruesome brutal history there that I've really enumerated, that, and you need to take all that barbed wire down. You need to like clean it. I mean, if you're going to do anything there, you can't just leave this rotting space for what's happened to all these people, you know, and then say it's a renaissance. So, and the state of Georgia needs to do that because it was their responsibility. When I was there for a semester, I was really urging to use the Powell building, it's one of the functional buildings, for a kind of institute on psychiatry and human rights. So it was really good stuff that happened in Milledgeville. This whole thing about Pellagra we didn't get a chance to talk about. So it's a place to study it. It's a place to use these manuscripts. Unfortunately, though, the train station museum that I was attracted to is now being repurposed for a larger kind of museum that really truncates the asylum history, and all of those manuscripts and archival materials and stuff have been boxed up for the past 5 or 6 years, and there's no indication they're going to come out. So the state of Georgia, over this history, like at a certain point when I was doing archival research out of the Georgia archives, Secretary of State Kemp wanted to close the whole thing down, and there was this whole campaign, no, Georgia needs its archives, and it got put into the education system, you know. So history is very dangerous to power, and especially to certain kinds of abusive power. There's a strain of that in Georgia, and it's still there, and folks in Georgia probably know where. You could name some names, you know. So all of that has to be taken into account and studied. And I've done my best to lay out some of it, but there's so much more to go. And there's tragedies and comedies. There's such rich material there. And Georgia's got a very rich strain of writers too. So unless that is taken into account, this ground will always have the spiritual and the environmental deficits that an early report for the Central State Hospital Authority listed. I do not think there's a spiritual deficit there of all the people who have lived there and fought there and tried to do better there. And for the really terrible things that have happened there, there's so much to learn. And I've just started a little bit of it. There's a huge amount more material, and I'm really hoping the book will kind of kick off more conversations. And I'm hoping to have more conversations with the people in Georgia. We're 2 minutes over, so I can't do it anymore, but I would love to just talk with y'all, answer your questions, you know. And I'm very sorry that I can't be there because of the COVID. I won't get there as soon as I can. And I'd love to have more of these conversations. So I really appreciate the chance.
Well, thank you for sharing this conversation with us today, Mab Segrest, author of Administrations of Lunacy, Racism and the Haunting of American Psychiatry at the Milledgeville Asylum. Thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome. Thank you.
We do encourage you to purchase the book. You can do it directly from the Acapella book link. It's in your chat on the right of your screen, or also at the link provided at the Atlanta History Center website. Tomorrow night, Isabel Wilkerson is going to be speaking about her new book, Cast, with John Meacham. It should be a fantastic conversation. Number of talks are scheduled for September. It's evolving all the time. You can go to atlantahistorycenter.com to sign up for tomorrow night or see what's coming up in September. But for now, thank you so much for joining us for the Atlanta History Center's virtual author talks. Good night.
Good night.